Hello, my name is Kay. Welcome to Art Book Nook. Here I love to share my collection of art and craft books. In this video we're going to explore the latest book from David Bellamy, Watercolour and Beyond. Including this book, can you believe that David has published 21 books in total and created 8 DVDs with APV films, while also teaching painting courses around the world and serving as a consultant for the Leisure Painter magazine. His watercolours are held in many private collections, including those of Sir Chris Bonington, Bill Bryson, Sir David Attenborough and Chris Packham. Quite a pedigree, don't you think? David says, in this book you'll discover a world of inspiration beyond pure watercolour, with over 60 original approaches and exercises. He aims to illustrate ways in which you can make your watercolours glow with excitement, offering you new methods of working and at the same time make the whole experience great fun. If you hear any strange noises in the background during this review, I do apologise. It's my little water terrier Tinker. Unfortunately, he's hurt his foot and he's having to wear a cone. He's not very happy about it. As you can see from these 2 content pages, this book is absolutely jam-packed with information, so I won't read all that out because I'm sure you're keen to just dive into the book. I should mention that this is the complete book review of Watercolour and Beyond, and it will last about an hour. I have actually split this down into 4 separate parts, so if you prefer to watch it in bite-sized chunks, you'll find a link to the playlist of all the separate parts in the description below. You may have already seen 1 or 2 of the parts, or you may have watched them all, I don't know, but this is the complete video of the whole book. So with that being said, let's take a look inside, shall we? In the introduction, David explains that his aim with this book is to show you ways to make your watercolours truly come alive, offering fresh methods of working and imaginative uses for familiar materials, all while keeping the process fun. We begin by looking at traditional approaches to painting landscapes in watercolour, before moving on to more adventurous techniques and materials. Along the way, we'll explore how to combine these methods effectively, opening up new possibilities for your own painting style. Many artists are put off watercolour painting because they find it difficult to master the techniques and expect instant success. Often, the challenge comes from choosing subjects that are too advanced for their current skill level. In this book, David aims to bring a sense of fun back into the learning process. He believes strongly that art should be enjoyed, that it's a powerful antidote to depression and illness, and like nature, has a therapeutic effect on our well-being and stress levels. David says that painting has been a great source of comfort in his own life, and the joy it brings him is sheer gold. We begin with foundations, exploring watercolour. This chapter covers the essential principles of pure watercolour, foundations every artist, no matter what their experience level, needs to understand. It starts with several simple, basic exercises designed to help you to get to know what really makes watercolour work. Even simple subjects need a little planning. The first step is deciding what to paint, and it helps to choose something with a clear, strong focal point. You'll also want to mix each colour just before you start, because watercolour dries quickly and some techniques work by blending colours right on the paper. On the right hand page you can see a straightforward pen and wash sketch on cartridge paper. David walks us through how he created it, and down in the bottom right hand corner he illustrates a fun splattering technique that adds speckled texture and interest to the foreground. Being able to handle washes with confidence is a crucial part of mastering watercolour. David highlights 5 key tips for success with washes, and he illustrates this with helpful photographs. He also explains how you can often rescue a painting by adding watercolour pencils into your washes. For example, in the painting of Dryswing Castle, the details are outlined using a dark watercolour pencil, giving it definition and depth. You might be eager to dive into a full colour palette, but David strongly recommends starting with a few monochrome paintings first. Working with just one colour frees you from worrying about colour choices and lets you focus on the values, how light or dark each part of your composition is. Here are two examples: Kent Estuary painted in indigo and Yorkshire Lane painted in burnt umber. David takes us through both paintings step by step, and I have to say I really love these. They have a kind of magical quality. I even feel a temptation to add a few silver and gold highlights, but just sparingly. Texture in watercolour can come in two ways: visually, where we create the illusion using different techniques, or physically, by adding mediums and materials to build a 3D effect. There are lots of watercolour paints on the market with highly granulating pigments, which give a speckled, gritty look as the pigment particles settle into the paper. These paints can really enhance a painting with very little effort from the artist. One of David's favourites is Lunar Blue by Daniel Smith, which funnily enough is one of my favourites too. From working in monochrome is just a small step to adding one or two more colours. Keeping your palette limited like this helps maintain harmony in your paintings while you continue to build your skills. Harmonious colours are those that sit close together on the same part of the colour wheel. In the painting on the left, you might notice David's use of French ultramarine, but he's only used it to sparingly darken other colours where he felt it was needed. This painting is of the old bridge at Ronda in Puente Viejo in Spain. The bridge spans a very deep chasm and it plunges down a very long way. I've been lucky enough to visit Ronda and walk across that bridge, and I can assure you the scenery there is truly breathtaking. It was pre-pandemic, and I have looked for my photographs, but I can't seem to find them. I'd have loved to have shared them with you. On the right-hand page, we have an illustration of a painting David created using a warm, harmonious colour palette called Windy Day in the Pennines, and on the bottom right, we have Farm in the Crags, where David has chosen a cool, harmonious palette. Now we're moving into a full colour painting. David usually selects a base colour for many of his mixes, as he finds this helps keep a sense of unity throughout the work. French ultramarine is a favourite. It's a great mixer and can create a wide range of tones. David outlines 5 key starting points for working confidently in full colour. The painting Summer in the Wye Valley is a perfect example, offering a great opportunity to explore how to approach those lush summer greens. He's included a helpful illustrated guide showing you exactly how to mix these, and if you'd like to try copying this painting yourself, David has thoughtfully listed the step-by-step process for you to follow. One really lovely watercolour technique is wet in wet, where you add fresh paint into an area that's still wet on the paper. This lets you create soft misty effects, perfect for painting distant trees or atmospheric backgrounds. The tricky part is knowing exactly when the first layer of paint is ready to accept the next. I really love David's painting of Little Neath River. You can clearly see how effective this technique can be. And did you spot one of David's favourite colours in there? Yes, Lunar Blue makes a beautiful appearance in the river. Dropping a colour into a wet wash is a technique David uses in almost every painting. It allows you to mix colours directly on the paper rather than in the palette. The key is to drop the colour in early and then leave the paint alone to dry. David stresses it's very important not to fiddle. Across these 2 pages, David has illustrated several colour combinations that you may find useful. A glaze is a transparent wash that you apply over part of your painting that's already dry. It's a really effective way to suggest things like falling rain, warm up cool areas and cool down warmer parts, or even add shadows. You need to use plenty of water when applying it to keep the look transparent. I once sat and watched a demonstration by the artist Charles Evans, who took a cool landscape painting and literally covered the entire thing with a wash of quinacridone gold. It completely changed the colour temperature of the piece. It was quite theatrical to watch and resulted in lots of gasps from the audience. In David's book, he's illustrated showing the glazing technique on a mountain scene. On the left you see the original. In the centre there's a warm glaze of permanent alizarin crimson, and on the far right a cooling glaze of French ultramarine blue. It's a wonderful illustration to see how glazing can transform a painting. By now, David hopes you've had a chance to try out several watercolour paintings, either by copying his examples in the book or working from your own images. Before we move on, he would like to guide you on how to gather good source material. Ideally, this should come from your own reference, sketches and photographs taken on location. Sketches are really helpful for making colour notes and capturing weather conditions, since photographs can often flatten colours. So it's best to use both if you can. David also shares practical advice about the equipment you'll need, and he often adds a touch of humour to his sketches, which makes the process even more memorable. The beauty of sketching in colour is that you're not only recording the colours you see, but also quietly learning how to handle watercolour as you go. And this is exactly how David learned to paint. Of course, it's easy to snap a quick photograph of the scene, but you'll discover so much more about your subject by sketching it. Plus, you're out in nature with no pressure to create a masterpiece. And if things don't go quite according to plan, well, you can always blame the wind, the cold, or even an overly curious sheep. I used to work for an agricultural charity, and the farmers would always say to me, a sheep wakes up in the morning and thinks, what method can I find to kill myself today? Joking apart, if you ever see a sheep lying on its back with its feet in the air, try and right it, try and gently roll it over back on its legs, and if you can't, see if you can find the farmer, because they will die if they're left like that. Anyway, back to David's lovely book. For colour sketching, David prefers using half pans. They're far less fiddly than tubes when you're out on location. His preferred brand is Daniel Smith watercolour paints because they activate instantly. Some brands take a fair bit of scrubbing before they produce any colour. And more recently, David's also been enjoying Daniel Smith's watercolour sticks, which offer yet another convenient way to work on location. Throughout this book you'll find sketches and alfresco paintings created with all sorts of materials. Painting from nature out in the open air is deeply rewarding, and there's no rule saying you have to finish the painting on location. If you look at the watercolour of the farmhouse near Dinas Mordwy, for example, it was drawn quickly in pencil with just a few colours washed in, giving it a wonderful sense of spontaneity. I really like this one. It has a semi-abstract quality. And David has listed 5 key points for successful outdoor painting. Rarely will you stumble across an outdoor scene with a perfect ready-made composition, which is why making changes to what is in front of you is such an important skill, and this is where sketches are incredibly helpful. Make sure you have a strong focal point. You might even introduce something new that feels right for the scene, perhaps a tractor in the distance or a grazing animal. It also helps to create a lead-in towards your focal point, such as a winding path, or as in the painting at the top right, a furrowed field. And don't forget the rule of thirds, placing your centre of interest about 1/3 in from one of the sides and 1/3 in from the top or bottom can really strengthen your composition. David gives some very helpful advice on using masking fluid to preserve light areas. His preference is PBO drawing gum because it's gentle on the paper. You can even lay in a light wash, let it dry and then apply the masking fluid over the top. When the gum is removed, the underlying wash stays put, unlike some brands that lift the paint away as well. Masking fluid often leaves a hard edge, but you can soften that later with a damp brush or a light glaze. On the right-hand page, David's used masking fluid in his painting Cottage Below Carn Foy, and he provides clear step-by-step instructions so you can follow along and have a go yourself. Here in part 2, we step into a world of more innovative techniques, materials and experiments, some you might not usually associate with watercolour painting. Exploring these ideas is not only fun, but it can also spark fresh inspiration for your own work. David encourages keeping a dedicated notebook to jot down your process with each technique as you try it. That way, you'll be building your own personal library of exciting effects, something you can revisit again and again whenever you need some creative inspiration. There are fresh ways to approach even the most traditional materials, and they can completely transform your style. The easy methods David shares here are designed to bring more energy, excitement and a sense of freedom into your paintings. He begins with 6 practical tips to help you loosen up, a goal many artists share. Even something as simple as changing your paper can make a noticeable difference. David favours a heavily textured knot paper, which adds a distinctive character to his work. Why not try a little experiment? Paint the same scene on hot-pressed, cold-pressed and knot paper, then compare the results. You might be surprised by how much the surface changes the feel of your painting. Recently, pouring paint has become a popular technique, usually with acrylics, but David shows you how you can do it successfully with watercolour as well. There are 4 key considerations which David has listed, and he then gives you 2 step-by-step demonstrations so you can try a loose expressive pour and a more controlled version. The effect is wonderfully spontaneous. The colours run and mingle and settle into the paper in ways you don't get with brushwork alone. But David also reminds you that a little planning and restraint will help to keep the results useful rather than accidental. Why not have a go yourself by copying David's demonstrations, but treat them as playful experiments rather than finished pieces? In the early days, Indian ink wasn't permanent and would fade over time, but today acrylic inks give us a lasting permanent result. They're really handy for drawing and for line and wash techniques, also known as pen and wash. In David's painting, Silver Tarn, shown on the left, he started with a clear wash of water across the sky, then applied Payne's grey acrylic ink with a swirling motion to suggest clouds. The effect is soft yet dynamic and captures the mood beautifully. David mainly uses pens for sketching buildings. While a fibre tip pen gives you a consistent even line, a dip pen is much more expressive. It creates interesting variations in line thickness. The downside is dip pens aren't very convenient when you're working outdoors on location. David also likes to apply ink using a rigger brush, which adds a lot of character and life to the lines. On the left-hand page you can see David's initial ink drawing, where he laid down monochrome washes using diluted black acrylic ink, and also the full colour version, where he applied light washes across the whole composition. It's a wonderful example of how layering ink and watercolour can really make an interesting piece. Occasionally, David will use little touches of acrylic paint to enhance or rectify a problem in watercolour. This alleviates the need to use masking fluid or negative painting to get light areas on top of a dark area. When dipped in paint and applied to your work, sponges can create some really interesting textures. It's a fantastic technique for painting things like pebbles, walls and foliage. David has shared some key tips to help you get the most out of sponging, along with a step-by-step demonstration that you can follow and try for yourself. In David's painting Buffalo in Bamboo Jungle, he used the edge of a piece of card dipped in green apatite genuine to stamp the dark tree trunks onto the paper. The lighter tree trunks and leaves were created using masking fluid. You can experiment by stamping with any suitable object that creates interesting marks in your own work. Why not try recreating David's painting yourself by following his step-by-step instructions? You can improve the composition of a painting by adding simple, subtle details. In this example, David has added rising smoke from the cottage to break up the background, made one of the trees more prominent to create a sense of depth, and introduced a large tree on the right to balance the scene. The puddle and pathway weren't part of the original view, but by including them, David's led the viewer's eye into the painting. In this example, David has included his original reference photograph so you can compare it with his painting, Tranquil Evening, Angle. He has cleverly redesigned the composition to make the painting more engaging. How many differences can you spot? You may want to treat yourself to a copy of David's wonderful book to explore this in more detail. I've included links to where you can buy your own copy in the description below. In Boisterous Surf, the diagonal sweep of the cloud formation and the front of the wave work together to create a real sense of drama. On the opposite page, David shows a composition built from several reference images, combined to form a more dynamic and engaging scene. Wow, this one is really something different. David's Through the Arctic Night was painted almost entirely with lunar black watercolour, with just the tiniest touch of cadmium red on the boat's hull. The energetic brushstrokes really crank up the drama, and then, this is the brave bit, David scratched into the paper with a scalpel, and to quote David, wielded with ferocious effect to capture the driving snow of a squall. It's very striking, isn't it? And it reminds me of J.M.W. Turner's painting called Snowstorm. David has really captured movement and atmosphere and raw energy on the page. In Light and Space, David explores ways to really make a painting glow, enhancing the feeling of light, giving a sense of distance, and even creating highlights using negative painting techniques. One of my favourite tricks is the one he shares called pulling out. It's a handy method and you can use it to form shapes, fix little mistakes or soften harsh edges, and it works well on both wet and dry surfaces. On the right hand page, I just love this semi-abstract piece. David explains that he felt the cottage on the horizon looked a little bit dark, so he overlaid it with a veil of oriental tissue paper to tone it down. Who'd have guessed? You've probably come across the idea of using cool colours to make things recede into the distance and warm colours to bring them forward. But here's the thing, sometimes a far-off feature can be bathed in warm sunlight, so it's not always as simple as cool at the back, warm at the front. It's worth really thinking about the colour temperature in the scene you want to capture. Another great technique David uses is called counterchange. It's a really effective way to guide the viewer's eye by placing light against dark. You instantly create contrast and focus. Take a close look at David's painting, Landstephen Bridge. Most of us might be tempted to paint the bridge in one solid colour, but not David. On the left, he's painted it in a deep green against a pale background. Then as your eye travels across, it shifts into a warm light buff shade set against the dark trees on the right. It's subtle, but it makes the whole scene so much more realistic. It may sound counterintuitive, but in watercolour, you actually create the feeling of light by painting the shadows around it. The contrast you build up between the light and dark gives that dazzling sense of brightness. This technique is called negative painting, and David shares some really good tips for making this work and illustrates exactly how he used it to paint the grasses in his piece Waiting for Dinner. Adding highlights in a sky can really lift a painting and make a simple scene more engaging. Across these pages, David shares several examples with handy tips on how to achieve this. Even though you might see a lot of hard edges and strong lines in the scene before you or a photograph, these don't always work well in a painting. On the left-hand page, David has used streaming clouds to break up the harsh lines of the ridges and dense trees by softening some of those edges. You can achieve this by pulling out colour, as we saw previously in the book, or by gently softening painted edges with an old brush. Over on the right-hand page, David has included a step-by-step demo so you can try this technique out for yourself. Water can be one of the trickiest things to paint, and David knows this well. He's even written a couple of books about it. Take rivers for example. The water can be calm and slow, or rushing fast and full of turbulence. David walks you through how to paint sparkling ripples, reflections and even submerged rocks, and they're all shown beautifully in his demo painting, Misty Wye at the Rocks. And here are two more water demos for you, sparkling water and how to paint sea spray. David encourages you to follow along step by step and copy his paintings. Remember, practice is the key to mastering water in your own individual work. Gouache is a water-based paint with excellent covering power for even dark colours in your painting. Normally, David only uses gouache for adding seagulls, white mass or small flowers, but the illustrations that follow will show you how much further you can take this medium. In the painting Exton Village Under Snow, David has used white gouache to add snow to several of the tree branches. In his painting Still Evening, white gouache was used again for the sliver of light in the sky and the reflection in the puddle. In the painting Snowdonia Cottage, David used white gouache to add the fence posts and cow parsley in the foreground. On the right-hand page in Wintry Squall, he's used white gouache again, this time to suggest sleet sweeping in from the left. David explains exactly how he achieved this effect, and he encourages you to try it for yourself by following his step-by-step demonstration paintings. You don't have to think of gouache as just an afterthought. You can actually use it right in the middle of the painting process. In Clouds Rising over Crib Goch, David painted in the white gouache for the clouds, whilst the sky wash of indigo and lunar black was still wet. He even swirled in some phthalo blue to create shadows. In Crashing Surf bottom left, the white gouache was added with a painting knife for bold textured highlights. And in Wild Coast, David combines both the wet in wet and the knife techniques for even more impact. I really love these paintings. I think they all have drama and movement, don't they? Figures will add a sense of life to any landscape. They instantly become the focal point in a composition, which is very useful in a painting where there is no obvious centre of interest. Some subjects, like towns, harbours or villages, really call for figures to make the scene feel believable. Take a look at how the architectural details behind the figures on the left have been softened or simplified, so the people really stand out as the focal point. When you're painting groups of figures, it's important that they relate not only to each other but also to the environment they're in. Masking fluid isn't just for the standard techniques we looked at earlier in David's book. It can be a really creative tool in lots of different ways. David shows you here how you can apply it with a painting knife to get extra fine lines, something that's tricky, if not impossible, with a brush. Take a look at how he suggests the delicate cow parsley using horizontal line work. In his painting of the hippo pool, David masked the lower bushes and then laid a wash of Apatite Genuine over most of the painting once the masking fluid was removed. He also mentions that he finished this piece quickly, not just because hippos can be quite dangerous, but mainly because of the appalling smell. Depicting scree, which are the loose rocks that tumble down mountain slopes, along footpaths or even pebbles along a beach, can be really effective using a heavily textured paper like knot, along with a dry brush loaded with colour but very little water. You can also add small rocks by dabbing in blobs of masking fluid first, letting them dry and then painting over the top. It's a simple trick that really brings the surface to life. On the right hand page is a close-up of detail from a full painting of David's, which appears in his Arctic Light book. And it was painted using the technique described here. David often uses the scumbling technique on a rough paper surface, like knot, to create wonderful visual texture. When you combine scumbling with masking fluid, it works brilliantly for rocks and even the edges of clouds. And remember, you don't have to put masking fluid only on bare white paper. You can also apply it over washes too, wherever you want to preserve part of the painting. And David reminds you Use an old brush for this. Masking fluid will ruin your best sable brushes. Creating visual texture will really lift a painting and make it more engaging. In David's piece, Sunshine and Mist on the Wye, take a close look at the large rock on the left. All that texture was created entirely with paint and clever brushwork. David explains exactly how he achieved it, so you can try the same techniques yourself. David mainly uses watercolour pencils for sketching, especially in misty wet weather or when it's snowing, as they allow him to keep working despite the conditions. But there's no reason why they can't be used to enhance a watercolour painting too, especially Derwent Inktense pencils with their rich vibrant colours. And here David shows how to capture the magical effect of thousands of starlings in flight, those mesmerising gatherings known as murmurations. And used on a wet surface, Inktense pencil can be gently smeared with a clean finger or brush. Laying plastic food wrap over a wet wash can create some fascinating texture, especially if you bring in more than one colour. It's a great technique for suggesting plants and undergrowth, and David also finds it works really well for icy surfaces or the natural striations you see in rock formations. Some pigments naturally granulate, and you can push this effect even further by using granulation medium, especially on a rough knot surface paper. Squirting the medium into a wash of granulating pigment can create some truly exciting textures. Just look at the effects David achieves here. While he often uses dry brush to capture scree, in his painting of Snowdonia he took a different approach. Laying down a wet wash of Lunar Black and Bloodstone Genuine, then squirting in granulation medium and tilting the board so the pigments flowed down the slope of the mountain. It's very effective, isn't it? On these 2 pages, David shares his key tips for getting the best results with granulation medium. I have to say, I really love the semi-abstract quality of his painting, Estuary Scene with Birds. It's a perfect example of how this technique can add atmosphere and depth. I'm really looking forward to trying it out myself. Across these 2 pages, we see David throwing caution to the wind and getting really experimental with granulating pigments and granulation medium. He admits this approach can lead to some really exciting results, and also some really exciting rubbish too. But he says it's always worth a try and encourages you to give it a go. The counterpart to visual texture is physical texture, and over the next few pages we'll explore exactly that. We begin with aquapasto, a medium you mix with watercolour paint in equal proportions, although David suggests using a little less water in the mix. It creates a subtle impasto effect. Impasto is an Italian word for mixture, and in painting terms it describes a technique where paint is applied thickly enough that brushstrokes or palette knife marks remain visible. It's perfect for adding detail to twigs, grasses, tree branches, masts and many other landscape features. In Pagham Harbour on the left-hand page, the foreground has been enhanced using aquapasto, while in Damp Morning, including it in the mix makes the netting far more effective. Gesso is a primer that can be applied with a roller, brush, spatula or painting knife, and it's often used with watercolour to build texture. However, David points out that watercolour doesn't always adhere well to gesso, and that can actually be an advantage. By rubbing colour off in certain areas, you can create highlights and interesting effects. On these pages, you'll find several examples where David has used gesso to add extra depth and character to certain areas in his paintings. And here is a step-by-step demo called Approaching Alpine Storm for you to try this out for yourself. While gesso can work well with watercolours, it's a little unpredictable. Watercolour ground, on the other hand, is specifically designed for watercolour work. Not only is it brilliant for creating striking and dramatic textures, but it can also be used in a soft, more subtle way. There are 2 main types, the schminky version, which is transparent and liquid, and the Daniel Smith version, which is more like a gesso paste and comes in different colours. On these pages, David shares several examples of how he's used watercolour ground, along with step-by-step details so you can try the technique for yourself. One of my favourite paintings of David's is this one, Huskies in the Snow. I think it's a beautiful atmospheric piece, and you'll also find this in David's book Arctic Light. I don't actually own Arctic Light yet, but I think I'm going to have to treat myself. Found materials can also be embedded into Daniel Smith watercolour ground to create wonderfully tactile textures. Using a painting knife, you can press items such as cord, bandage or fabric into the wet ground and then plaster over them. This needs several days drying time before you paint on top. Here David shares his own tips for success with watercolour ground along with two fascinating examples. In Cottage above Ross Gadfan, top right, he glued a couple of cut strips of bandage to the paper to suggest fencing, combining both Schminke and Daniel Smith ground to achieve different textures. In Moorland Cottage, bottom right, short strips of cord were pressed into the surface, then covered with Daniel Smith ground, adding a subtle yet striking dimensional quality to the finished piece. Collage can take many forms, from delicate layers of tissue paper to bold cutouts of figures, signs, words and more. Personally, I think collage is an underrated art form. There are some truly fantastic collage artists out there, and I'm planning a video soon to showcase them. What I love most is that collage lets you break the rules. You can combine almost anything, and it's a brilliant way to make a statement or add humour to your work. Anyway, back to David. On the left, he shares two examples where collage was used to create the texture of rocks. One combining oil pastel with collage, and another using tissue paper. In the top right example, David has glued torn pieces of a map into the background, while in Casa Mauricio, bottom right, the neon sign was cut from a photograph and applied directly to the painting. Tissue paper isn't something David reaches for often, but he admits it can produce some very striking textural effects. In his demonstration painting, Farm at Lanfilo, he explains how he applied tissue paper to create the furrows in the snow. And in his painting on the right-hand page, the natural crinkles in the tissue were used to suggest fissures and other features in the rocky foreground. People are led to believe that you cannot change or rescue a watercolour if you make a mistake, but David says this isn't true. And in this episode, we're going to look at David's tips and tricks to help you rescue what you consider to be a failed painting. And we also look at Beyond Wall Art. David will give you several ideas for how to display and how to use your paintings, besides just hanging them in a frame on a wall. So let's have a look, shall we? Few scenes begin with a perfect composition, so before David moves on to showing you how to rescue a watercolour, he illustrates how he approaches composition and highlights some key points for you to focus on, using his painting Winter Barn as an example. This piece is a mixed media work combining both watercolour and gouache. David has created two different paintings here to show how a scene can be reinterpreted. In the first, on the left, he explains the compositional changes he made and the techniques he used to capture the ghostly ridge in the distance, the more dynamic ridge in the midground, and the texture in the foreground. I've enlarged David's reference photo, top right, so you can compare his creative decisions to the original view below. I should apologise for the poor quality of the photograph. It's very small in the book and doesn't enlarge very well, but I felt it was important to include it for your comparison. In the second painting, David takes a much looser approach, once again taking us through his choices and techniques. I really love this painting. I think it's beautiful. On the previous pages, we looked at how David reinterprets entire scenes, but sometimes it's the small details that make all the difference. In his painting of the old barn, David illustrates how he suggested the corrugated iron roof. By painting directly onto corrugated cardboard and stamping it onto the watercolour paper, he created a texture that looks really true to life. It's a simple method yet very effective, don't you think? In this example, David shows how he creates realistic features using found objects combined with watercolour ground, giving the illusion of the real thing. He worked on a heavyweight watercolour paper to take the medium, and for the fishing net he used a small piece of plastic netting pressed into the surface. It's a clever way, isn't it, of bringing texture and authenticity into a painting. Here David demonstrates how altering the lighting in a scene can completely change the mood. On the left-hand page you'll see a photograph of the original view, and below that David's interpretation bathed in golden light. It's a really good example, isn't it, of how creative choices with light can transform a subject. Look how David has cleverly transformed a flat dull grey day into a sunlit scene. He painted it as though it was bathed in sunlight, and illustrates how he created the shafts of light by lifting paint with a damp sponge. The rough texture in the foreground was achieved using sea salt. Different sizes of crystals give different effects. A really good exercise is to experiment in your sketchbook with various washes and types of salt, building your own little library of textures to refer to later. In this painting, David used a candle for a wax resist to create the sparkling light across the water, and schminky coarse paste to give the rough texture in the foreground. I'm really impressed with how he's rendered the sky. He also provides detailed instructions so you can try these techniques for yourself. Wow, this is impressive, isn't it? This double-page spread is only slightly larger than David's original painting, Grand Canyon at Yellowstone. You really get to see his brushstrokes in all their detail. We've seen how David changes what he sees before him when he begins painting. Now he shares his methods for improving flaws and rescuing mistakes in watercolour. On the left-hand page, he rescued misty track by adding more colour and creating a more interesting foreground. In the painting of the farm on the right, David made the farm building more of a focus by increasing the contrast between it and the trees behind, while once again adding more interest to the foreground. As David neared completion of this painting, he wasn't happy with the middle distance moorland, where he had used a candle for wax resist. He wanted to darken this area to give it more strength, but of course watercolour won't adhere to wax. To see how David overcame this challenge, I've included links in the description below as to where you can buy a copy of this wonderful book. Even with careful planning, it's not uncommon for a finished painting to have an element in it that you want to remove. David wasn't happy with the gate between the two trees. Watercolour can be reactivated when wet, so paint can often be lifted out, unless of course you've used staining colours. With care, David gently removed the gate using a damp sponge and paper tissue. David has used this technique to rescue many paintings from oblivion. Here David explains how he's improved paintings by simply cropping them to enhance the composition, and he provides two lovely examples to illustrate this. Most artists eventually find themselves with an ever-growing collection of paintings tucked away in drawers, which can feel quite discouraging. David shares several ideas for how you can share your artwork. I particularly love the delicate colours in David's painting of a steam train, and how he's captured the mist and steam. It's really atmospheric. Over time, family events can easily be forgotten, but creating an art project to record them can bring family history to life for future generations. David decided to illustrate some of the more interesting events from his own family history. With his granddaughters in mind, he depicted his grandfather's experiences in the Boer War of 1901, incorporating collage, maps, photographs, diagrams and of course text. Here is another example of a very personal project from David, where he's journalled memories and experiences from his travels. Notice his handwritten notes, such a lovely touch. In these digital times, I think this is especially worthwhile. It reminds me of when one of my school friends married in 1983 and went to live abroad. There were no mobile phones back then, and landline calls were difficult, so she would write me long, beautiful letters describing her surroundings and what she was doing. I still have those letters today, and they're such a joy to read every now and then. Have you thought about enhancing your sketchbooks? David often does this. He loves maps, and he'll leave pages clear so he can add maps of his route, along with leaflets, tickets and photographs later. It makes his sketchbook feel like a complete record of his journey. One genre David particularly enjoys is recreating history. He sees it as a fascinating challenge. His approach begins with research, reading about the location, studying old black and white photographs, and then sketching out a composition before he finally tackles the finished piece. Well, now we've reached the end of David's book, so let's take a moment to look back at what he shared with us. In part 1, David explored the foundations of watercolour, materials, techniques and ways of building confidence with the medium. Part 2, he encouraged us to be more adventurous, experimenting with mixed media, textures and unconventional tools. In the third part of the book, he showed us how collage, pastels and granulation mediums can transform a painting, giving it depth, texture and sometimes even humour. And in the final part, David reminded us that no painting is ever truly lost. With imagination, you can rescue, reinterpret and even repurpose your work, while also finding meaningful ways to share it with other people. This book forms such an inspiring journey. David not only gives us the skills and techniques, but also the freedom to experiment, make mistakes and see art as something living and personal. I think that's what makes this book so special. It's not just a manual on how to paint, but it's an invitation to create, explore and enjoy the process. This book is a real treasure for anyone who loves watercolour, and if you've been inspired by what you've seen here, you'll find so much more inside David's book. It's a resource you'll turn to again and again, and I think every watercolour artist will find something valuable within its pages. I've put links to where you can treat yourself and buy your own copy of this book in the description below. Publishers nowadays only actually print a limited number of books, so don't miss out. Make sure you get hold of your own copy. I've also put links to where you can find out more information about David Bellamy and his work. I've linked to David's website and his social media channels, and there's also a couple of links to some videos on YouTube with David doing a demo. I hope you found this review helpful. If you did, please give the video a like. It really helps YouTube share it with others who enjoy art books too. I post a new art book review every week, so if you'd like to see more, do consider subscribing. I truly appreciate it. If you found the review helpful, please feel free to leave a comment below. I reply to everyone. And if there's an art book you'd like me to feature, just let me know. I'll do my best to review it for you. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy painting.